Welcome to the third webinar of this four-part series on pandemics in the ancient world. My name is Tyler Franconi. I'm a visiting assistant professor of archaeology at Brown University here in the United States. And I welcome you all today and thank you for joining us for another part of this series. Now, I know that many of you have been to past events, so some of this will be a little repetitive, but I do need to just go over a few points about the format. So I'll introduce today's speaker, Professor Hunter Gardner, in just one moment. But I'd like to first remind everybody that after a presentation of about 45 to 50 minutes today, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Due to the scale of this event, though, we're not going to be able to turn on attendees' audio or video. So we ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions that you might have either during or after the talk, and I will present them to our speaker during the discussion at the end. A final reminder that this presentation is going to be recorded and will be posted online afterwards on the Brown YouTube channel. I'm also pleased to announce that as of this morning, both of our previous two webinars are up from Kyle Harper and Andrew Wilson. Okay, with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Hunter Gardner. Hunter is professor of classics at the University of South Carolina, where she's also an affiliate of the Women's and Gender Studies, as well as a core member of the Comparative Literature program, as well as the South Carolina Honors College. Her work focuses on Latin literature of the late Republican and early imperial periods, as well as its later reception. And this work has most recently focused on the development of plague narratives in Roman and later literary traditions. She's written or edited 3 books, including 2013's monograph, Gendering Time, an Augustan Love Elegy, as well as an edited volume in 2014 together with Sheila Murnaghan entitled Odyssean Identities in Modern Cultures, The Journey Home. And most recently, 2019's Oxford University Press's Pestilence and the Body Politic in Latin Literature. And she'll be talking a bit about this work today, in particular reference to Seneca's Oedipus. So Hunter, it's great to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us. I turn it over to you.
So first thing I want to do is actually just thank the organizers, some of whom I just met. Tyler, of course, has done a fantastic job putting all of this together. I'd like to also thank my predecessors. Both of them have given me great material to respond to. I was particularly struck by the issue, raised with a good deal of caution, of parallels between the Roman Empire in decline and the current state of the American enterprise. If a disease event, the Antonine Plague, further weakened the infrastructure of Roman governance and ushered in political dynastic transformation, from the Aurelian to the Severan dynasty, COVID-19 might also prove to accompany, if not actually catalyze, radical political change. And in both late 2nd century Rome and 21st century America, the way our leaders respond to a diseased body politic can foster further reflections on precisely what is the most salubrious relationship between ruler and ruled. One quote cited in Kyle Harper's earlier seminar, attributed to Marcus Aurelius by the writers of the Augustan history, is worth further consideration. Why do you weep for me and not instead give thought to the pestilence and death, which is the common lot of all? So those were Marcus Aurelius's words on his deathbed, reportedly. The quote certainly indicates the kind of compassionate self-sacrifice from our leaders that we might expect in the context of an epidemic. And it is precisely what we expect from our leaders that I'll be discussing today, though I'll be shifting my focus back further in time, well before the Antonine Plague, to examine the discourse of politics and disease circulating during the Julio-Claudian Principate. The genesis of this presentation began with the origins of COVID-19 spread within the US and the Trump administration's efforts to manage it. Back in March, a friend of mine who was aware that I'd just completed a book on plague narratives made the point that our president, in his desperate attempt to lay blame for the disease on a source external to the US, was the kind of Oedipus figure, a parallel that we jokingly extended to the complicated interfamilial relationships that have defined his tenure in the White House. As his response to the no longer so novel coronavirus has evolved, I've come to see the soon-to-be former president as something of a foil to Oedipus, as I hope these two quotes suggest. Trump's comments at a recent rally in Omaha downplay the severity of the disease while also tying the president to the COVID-stricken population, a move that simultaneously aligns this otherwise exceptional individual with the masses of disease sufferers, and also perhaps underscores his superhuman ability as a 74-year-old to overcome it. No big deal, I had it, here I am. Beneath the quote, and offering something of a contrast, we have a remark from Seneca's Oedipus, where the king ponders why he alone has been spared. But both quotes expose something of a paradox. Leaders marketing themselves as or expressing a desire to be just like you and me, while also posing as adamantly exceptional. And here we have an image of Trump at a June rally collocated with an image of Louis Boulmeister in a late 19th century Dutch production of Oedipus. As I'll explore further in this presentation, Seneca's Oedipus, possibly written during the reign of the Emperor Nero, illustrates the power of disease rhetoric to shine a light on the paradox mentioned above, and on the problematic relationship that can develop between a leader and his or her people. In Seneca's drama, the Theban king ostensibly wants to suffer along with his people, but also remains fixated on his exceptional status, not only his exemption from the plague, but in his elevation to the kingship through his remarkable ability to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. And of course, this was a famous moment in his career that had been depicted in many visual arts, including this 5th century Kylix. And of course, this is what led to his ascendancy in Thebes. Now, today I'll start by observing the distinctly Roman idioms of plague that inform the representation of Seneca's hero and disease in Thebes. As I argue in my book, Latin literature contributed distinctly Roman tropes to the way that literary and visual artists have depicted a diseased body politic over the last 2,000 years. Narratives of contagious disease show us not only how we are connected, but with whom, even as the threat of mortality and the impulse to self-preservation strain those relationships to the breaking point. Roman poets exploited that discursive power, using it as a metaphor to diagnose the civil wars that afflicted the Republic in the late 1st century BCE. These same poets and their successors also capitalized on and questioned the expurgatory power of disease, what Susan Sontag described as a tabula rasa. That is to say, the power of contagious, lethal illness to wipe the slate clean. And what RENÉ GIRARD, whom I'll discuss further in a moment, articulated through his notion of the scapegoat, a figure of contamination whose expulsion can restore a broken social order. After reviewing some of the distinctive features that color Roman representations of epidemic disease, we'll examine the quality of Oedipus's leadership in Seneca's tragedy, focusing on the significant departures between Seneca's hero and his Sophoclean predecessor, as well as the intertextual engagement that binds this newer Oedipus to Ovid's depiction of another king who must remedy a plague-stricken population, Iacchus of Aegina in Book 7 of the Metamorphoses. But it isn't enough to track the reception of tropes and remark on their persistence. We also have to speculate on why they have persisted and what they can tell us about our own diseased body politic. As I discussed in the third and final part of this presentation, and looking more to the historical record, plague of 65 CE in Campania broke out during the reign of Nero, when some scholars assigned the production of Seneca's Oedipus. Seneca's use of pestilence to craft a meditation on the dynamics of power operating in the Julio-Claudian Principate would be all the more resonant in the context or even recent memory of an actual outbreak of contagious disease. It is my hope as well that we can use our understanding of the rhetoric surrounding COVID-19 to better understand how we, the people of the United States, have supported this particular brand of leadership over the past 4 years, and what new leadership might mean for the health of the body politic. Writers of the late Republican and Augustan periods found pestilence an effective metaphor for civil strife. They added distinctly Latin idioms used to describe the deteriorating physical corpus. They're very interested in the language of rot and liquefaction. Bodies just seem to disintegrate under the impact of plague. These writers also focus on social pathologies that reflect on distinctly Roman values, especially pietas under pressure. Unlike their Greek forerunners, Roman accounts of disease foreground distinct relationships between parents, children, siblings, spouses, relationships frequently compromised in the context of an epidemic, and also in the context of a civil war. Such representation allowed Lucretius, Virgil, and Ovid to explore the civil strife that brought down the Republic in the late 1st century BCE, and speculate on the new order ushered in by Augustus in the early 1st century CE. And for those of you who are not as familiar with Roman history, I thought I'd take just a moment to highlight some key moments at the end of the Republic. If we tracked civil strife in Rome, if we gave a full account, it would of course go all the way back to Romulus and Remus, but I figured 48 was a decent time to start, since that's within the living memory of the poets I discussed mostly in this project. So in 48 BCE, of course, Caesar defeats his fellow citizen and also former son-in-law, Pompey, at Pharsalus. After that, he ruled Rome as a dictator, more or less, until he was slain in the Ides of March of 44. Now, of course, civil war broke out again between Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius and the rest, and his chief avengers, Mark Antony and Octavian in particular. They, in fact, formed another triumvirate with a fellow named Lepidus, and worked to defeat Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Now, after this, of course, the relationship between Octavian and Mark Antony grows increasingly unstable. And of course, Mark Antony really sets up shop in Alexandria and Egypt with Cleopatra, which doesn't help matters. Eventually, the situation comes to a head where officially Octavian is making war against Egypt, but really in 31, we have an extension of the civil wars that had preceded them. At the Battle of Actium, which of course left Octavian more or less the undisputed master of the Roman world. By 27, Octavian was renamed Augustus and ruled Rome as the princeps, or first citizen, although effectively he is an emperor, but he called the government he established, or it is often referred to as the Principate. He initiated about 2 centuries, give or take, of relative peace and died in 14 CE. His successors, immediate successor Tiberius, and then up through Nero are referred to as the Julio-Claudian emperors. And of course, the abdication and suicide of Nero will put us sort of where we are today in 68 CE, or where, in other words, where Seneca is writing. All right, so even after civil discord had been, at least for a time, resolved under the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the language of pestilence and its implications for civil war and the end of the Republic continued to proliferate. A distinct tension between the competitive drives of the aristocracy for limited honores and the ideal of a res publica governed in fraternal concord would continue to preoccupy those who would contemplate the value of the new principate. Even Roman citizens born long after the waters at the Battle of Actium were stilled. It is not merely fortuitous that the Romans chose contagious disease as a metaphor for addressing the problems of internal discord that brought down the Republic. Theorists of disease discourse have observed that these narratives, whether clinical accounts or fictive recreations, reveal tensions within the body politic. RENÉ Girard is concerned with how epidemic disease and its representation have a homogenizing and potentially purifying effect upon afflicted communities. Girard focuses intently on epidemics in the literary and mythic imagination and their role in staging social crises, eroding markers of distinction and dramatizing the dissolution of the social bond. And here on this slide, I have a few of his more important works related to the topic, and also a few of the quotes that I'm gonna bring in. For Girard, contagion initiates a process of undifferentiation and a destruction of specificities, one that culminates not primarily in a tabula rasa, as Sontag suggested, but instead the identification of a sacrificial scapegoat, whose expulsion purifies the polluted social order. He observes how these narratives tend to transform the existing societies, conceived of as finely graded systems of hierarchies, into an aggregate, a homogeneous mass. In reflecting on physically misguided impressions of how the bubonic plague bacillus works to dissolve internal organs, and here Girard is actually responding to the work of Antonin Artaud, who also is interested in plague as a metaphor, but describes the bubonic plague as something that really caused the insides of a person to pretty much disintegrate. So Girard observes this loss of differentiation is medically mythical, but aesthetically powerful because it patterns the pathological systems on the breakdown of culture, producing an overwhelming impression of disintegration. However medically mythical liquefaction is with respect to bubonic plague, it is a symptom of contagious disease whose provenance we can trace to Virgil, who furthers the process of dissolution already implicit in Lucretius's account of pestilence in Athens. In other words, that's the bodily dissolution and rotting that the Roman poets are so interested in. Such a collapse of distinctions within the social order is born from intense competition for limited honors. And the end point, both discursively and in terms of in terms of the physical reality, are indistinguishable bodies. Like those mass graves, the ones, for instance, at Gloucester that Andrew Wilson showed us last week. Girard describes this competition for the same distinctions that results in a kind of mirroring between individuals as mimetic doubling, and posits this as one of the three central features of the plague narrative. So in addition to the disease pathogen achieving epidemic status, its narrative triggers rivalry among mimetic doubles, binaries that will collapse through transgression and a failure to differentiate. And the process will culminate in a sacrificial theme that may take the form of a scapegoat process, in which the expulsion of an element deemed contaminated allows distinctions to reassert themselves. While I do not wish to imply that Girard's model is the only or even the best way to account for the tendency of cultures to produce plague narratives. I do think that the model allows us a better understanding of why Romans, who were so plagued by civil war in the late 1st century, might use plague narratives to work through, even diagnose and treat, the competitive strife among equals that had led to civil war. A war among brothers, fratres, who gradually, while striving for complete autonomy, lose the ability to differentiate themselves. Girard translates this further into a scenario wherein plague emblematizes the mimetic nature of desire. We want what other people want, a tendency Girard sees as endemic in the social order. When the desires of two individuals converge upon the same object, those individuals imitate each other, and a conflict inevitably arises between them. This kind of cultural crisis is frequently resolved through stereotypes of persecution that allow the collective to identify an individual or subculture of individuals who must bear responsibility for the crisis. While restoration of the status quo is frequently the consolation of Girard's master plague narrative, the purging of the community through a scapegoat can alternatively result in the birth of a new order. This model offers a useful way of formulating the political strife of the late Republic, where powerful aristocrats, backed by increasingly powerful armies, vied with each other for command of Rome. So it's the competitive drives provoking strife between near equals that lies at the heart of the Western plague narrative, a model that would seem to aptly diagnose the pathologies of the Roman social order, and in particular, the problematic orientation of its exceptional individuals, its heroes. So Seneca is among those imperial writers who use the pestilence motif to pick at the threads of the seams of what should be a metonymic relationship between an individual hero and the Roman collective he represents. As Philip Hardy has observed, the singularity of the epic hero and his ability to stand alone as one for many is a fundamental preoccupation of epic poetry. The Roman ventures in epic, especially after Virgil, constantly throw up near equals or doubles to confound the power of an individual, no longer superlative if rivaled, to represent the whole. Thus, Seneca, by offering a hero in Oedipus who is obsessed with his unique power to save a plague-stricken population, relies on preoccupations familiar from Latin epic. And Seneca's desire to import such epic features into his tragedy confirms contemporary interest in reassessing a monarchical government, in other words, the regime that he's living in under Nero, as the outcome of a fiercely two-headed civil war. But before delving into that treatment, it's worth considering how Seneca has adapted, Romanized, and revised the plague and Oedipus's response to it by comparing his treatment to Sophocles' version of the drama. So a few words about Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus. In the 5th century Athenian tragedy, plague purifies the population and isolates the king in his function as a scapegoat. From a Girardian perspective, Oedipus's expulsion from Thebes completes the purification process by allowing a community to transfer its propensity for mimetic reciprocal violence upon a single individual. Sophocles' Oedipus emerges as a pharmakos, both infected carrier of disease and savior to the Theban civic body. The status of Sophocles' Oedipus as a plague text is incontestable, as Mitchell Boyask argues in his study of nosological patterns in the drama. The playwright's introduction of a loimos, and we'll find reference to that on just another slide in a moment. The loimos that afflicts Thebes at a time when the Athenians were still reeling from casualties of their own plague may have negatively impacted the OT's initial reception. So here actually we have slide with the first mention of the loimos, which is actually uttered by the priest. Now, at the same time, the tragedy's account of plague's effects on the population is abbreviated and evocative rather than explicit. In Sophocles, combined accounts of disease given by the priest and the chorus total about 30 lines, without mention of symptoms or epidemiological observations, aside from countless dead and constant supplication at the altars of the gods. Seneca, writing about 500 years later and in a different cultural context, explodes the smattering of details in Sophocles and fuels the drama of his own project with language of plague borrowed from his late Republican and Augustan predecessors. The expansion of plague dramaturgy that accompanies the transference of the Oedipal myth from a Greek context to a Latin one demonstrates the peculiar fixation of the topos in the Latin epic tradition. And moreover, brings into better focus how competing claims of individuality and collectivity have helped shape that tradition. As we have seen, Seneca's Oedipus draws attention to his singular status and its uncomfortably superlative relationship to the Theban people. Thebes, moreover, is drawn as a template for civil war, as audiences are reminded of the impending conflict between Oedipus's sons. By addressing the communal effects of pestilence within a text that questions the efficacy of Roman law and depicts isolation that accompanies autocratic power, Seneca secures the role of contagion as a tool for examining the health of a new order born under the accession of Augustus and grown to maturity under the Julio-Claudian emperors. Using language of plague gleaned from earlier Latin poets, Seneca explores peculiarly Roman concerns over the origins and impact of civil war, echoed within the tragedy by the war to be fought among Oedipus's successors in the not too distant future. Crisis afflicting Thebes is only apparently resolved with the abatement of plague, which is closely identified with the king himself. And we will actually look at that slide in just a few minutes, the ending of the play. Audiences are well aware that the same internecine strife endemic in Thebes and the cause of the current plague is bound to repeat itself. So Seneca uses plague to reflect on the relationship between the community and those charged with governing it. Now, this is already a contentious issue in the Oedipal drama Seneca inherited from Greece. Though, as commentators have emphasized, the originally democratic context of Sophocles' drama has been replaced by a newly monarchical one. In Seneca, plague corrupts family relationships throughout Thebes in ways that not only reflect the perversions in Oedipus's own family, but also reiterate the tendency of Lucretius, Virgil, and Ovid to entangle family relationships with the pathologies of civil war. Given the force of such entanglements, how can any individual govern in a way that is truly aimed at the well-being of the community? Now, in Sophocles' tragedy, and this is the last we're going to linger on the Sophocles version, but in the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus had articulated his leadership in Thebes in comparably intimate terms that stress identification between ruler and subjects. And so here we have Oedipus's response to the priest. After the priest sort of gives him the lay of the land and this is what's going on. Now, so starting in line 59, and I'll just translate, I know you are all sick, yet there is not one of you, sick though you are, that is as sick as myself. Tragic ironies of the statement aside, Oedipus indicates that he has assumed the suffering of the entire Theban populace, in contrast with the private citizen, who has only individual sufferings to endure. Such comments, along with an opening dialogue shared between Oedipus, the priest, and eventually Creon, embed the king of Sophocles' play within his community. Seneca parts company with his predecessors by dwelling on the distance between the rex and his subjects. As Albini observes in light of the Greek tragedy, Seneca's version isolates the king. His opening query and the title of this presentation, Quisquam ne regno gaudet, ostensibly locates the great burden of managing the plague on the lonely shoulders of the speaker. And yet it also points, if ironically, to the privileges often associated with kingship, regnum, where in Sophocles, Oedipus's opening query about why citizens sit as suppliants before the palace is quickly answered by the priest, who initially names the loimos. For Seneca, Oedipus himself names the plague as a lues and a pestis, and questions his own well-being in light of the widespread destruction. So here we'll look at the opening lines of Seneca's Oedipus. So Oedipus fears that he's been reserved for a greater calamity, as we had observed at the beginning of this talk in the opening epigraph. What else should I think? When that pestilence spread far and wide, stains the Cadmean race, but spares me alone. Parcit uni mihi. Amidst the widespread suffering of his people, the king's self-interest is striking and restated at the close of his exposition in comments emphasizing again his singular status. This is not in this particular quote, but he later says, a ready death is denied to me alone, uni mihi, among this people of mine. While initially a source of vulnerability and later a cause for outright dismay, Oedipus's singularity is also a point of pride, emerging as observed earlier from his unique ability to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. By contrast, the citizens of Thebes, standing in the shadows of Oedipus's towering stature, imperia excelsa fortunae, are rendered with increasing anonymity, again through Latin traditions of narrating pestilence that emphasize accumulation, erasure of identity, and boundary dissolution. And we're going to look at a passage that deals with that in more detail, but I want to just stay with the opening monologue for just another minute. In his opening monologue, Oedipus announces his concern with pietas, and that is at line 19. That is respect and sense of duty towards gods, family, and patria. This is a quintessentially Roman value that was reoriented in the Augustan period. While pietas continued to be defined in terms of mutual respect among family members, it gained new resonance in the early Principate as Augustus worked to realign the relationship between Roman subjects and himself in his relatively novel role as leading citizen and pater patriae, father of the country. While Oedipus fears chiefly his own transgressions of misera pietas, the plague he describes has put pressure on the pietas practiced by Theban citizens in such a way that reverberates uncomfortably with the perversions of interfamilial devotion about to be disclosed on stage. The drama of Theban lues recalls the same tightening and dissolution of familial bonds that Seneca's predecessor used the plague narrative to explore in Latin epic. And it's not altogether clear how contagious disease might allow a given social order to test the bonds of pietas, in other words, to test familial loyalties. We need only to consider some of the many dilemmas that have confronted families recently during the COVID pandemic, when hugging a grandparent could prove lethal, or doing a job that's necessary to feed your family could also infect your family with the virus. The citizens of Thebes will eventually falter in familial respect associated with pietas, but not before making a concerted effort to uphold it. And I'm just going to read the last part of the translation here of, okay, let me get to, sorry, here we are. This is the description of what's going on among the Theban people. And yeah, I'll just read the translation for the last few lines. A sick father carries a son to his final fire. A mother, mad with grief, carries another son and hurries along so that she might collect yet another son for the same pyre. Mourners at funeral fall dead around the body, with the result that fresh grief arises amidst grief itself. Next, citizens burn the bodies of their own kin with flames not their own. Fire is stolen. There is no sense of shame among the wretched, nor do separate tombs cover hallowed bones. It is enough to have burned them. How great a part turns to ash. Plague eventually destroys all familial identities along all categories of age and sex, an outcome emerging with special emphasis in the Latin plague narratives of the Principate. The familial and relational identities destroyed are included here with thematic resonance, since the destruction of categories among the plague-stricken populace mirrors the incest as an erosion of familial distinction par excellence within Oedipus's family. As graves no longer distinguish one individual's remains from the next, non ossa tumuli sancta discreti tegunt, the Theban citizenry fades into colorless dystopia and serves increasingly as a backdrop for the exceptional nature of its ruler. The end of Oedipus's opening account turns from melancholy observation on the great part of the city already subsumed in flames to his own invocations of the gods, two details that harken back to another mythological monarch faced with a similar crisis, Ovid's Iacchus. For those of you who are not familiar with the tale of Iacchus and the Myrmidons in the Metamorphoses, I'm going to give you a quick recap. In Ovid's epic, the citizens of Aegina, nearly eradicated from pestilence sent by Juno, are replaced by ant-born men, the Myrmidons, bound to serve as soldiers in a war between Athens and Crete. The Myrmidons constitute a new citizenry dreamt into existence by King Iacchus after he receives signs from Jupiter in the form of ants filing up a nearby oak tree. The privileges, grants of land, and functions serving in war awarded to this new population effectively sort out the confused heaps of those rotting bodies of kin and acquaintances left in the wake of contagion, but hardly offer a sustainable model for the Roman citizenry. So it's my argument, basically, that the episode should be read as a reflection of Ovid's cynical attitude towards Augustus's attempt to restore a war-depleted population by replacing it with a new generation of loyalists. Now, on this passage, I have included, or on this slide, I've included a passage describing the miraculous restoration of the citizen body and the king's role in managing this new population. And by the way, just as a side note, Christoph Ransmayer's fictionalized account of Ovid's exile, The Lost World, actually suggests that it is this passage which makes ants seem very proto-Roman and not in a very flattering way. So in other words, he suggests it's this passage that earns the ire of Augustus, which down the line leads to his exile. The poet's narrative of recovery thus broaches the political utility of pestilence in such a way that questions the rigorous mechanisms of recovery, often in the form of population controls, implemented by the Augustan Principate. And we can talk more about those controls in the Q&A if you're interested. It's important to stress that these Myrmidons have no families, no loyalties to anyone other than their creator, Iacchus. Narratological and mythological parallels allow Seneca to find in Ovid's Iacchus a suitable source of expressions for communicating Oedipus's Theban dilemma. Both kings act as a narrator in their respective accounts of a plague they are responsible for curing. In other words, they are in charge of giving the plague a discursive shape and highlighting the ability to control the narrative that has proven such a contentious issue in recent outbreaks of contagion. All the same, tragic like lack of foresight for Oedipus and the reassurance of hindsight for Iacchus create stark but telling discrepancies in the tone of each account. Both kings are asked to interpret signs, and Iacchus's initial failure but eventual success will cast in sharper relief the devastating blindness Seneca's king experiences when it comes to the circumstances in which he is entangled. Oedipus remarks on the bones and ash of his people, or his remarks on the bones and ash of his people rephrase the comments of Iacchus, who, in responding to a request that he disclose a painful memory, laments the bonds that he shared with his former people, now reduced to bones and ash. And I'm going to go back to the previous slide because I've put the quote from Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Seneca is echoing that passage in his own, in Oedipus's own monologue that opens the play. So while the Aeginetan king will eventually embrace his new population of Myrmidons, his remarks here are consistent with other comments in his tale that reflect on his identification with his former people and his desire to share their sufferings. Precise echoes of Iacchus's words from Metamorphoses 7 within Seneca's Oedipus construct a template for governance, and in particular for how a king should respond to the hardships of his people, a template to which Oedipus's own response cannot quite conform. Oedipus may express a willingness to experience the plague, but such expressions have the effect of highlighting the distinction between ruler and subjects. Oedipus's desire not to be the last to fall, which he mentions in line 74, asserts the king's role as protector of his people, but he does so using adamantly superlative terms, after all, post omnis, as well as finally, echoing an emphasis on the unique status he has claimed elsewhere in the play. In light of such verbal and situational parallels, as well as the different embodiments of monarchical authority these parallels reveal, can we say that Oedipus, like other characters in Seneca's dramas who use Ovidian language, is an interpreter of the Ovidian character he evokes? And if so, what is this Oedipus saying about his predecessor, Iacchus? If both are figures who bear some relationship to political authority as it existed in the extra-textual Roman world, how might Iacchus, as played by Oedipus, comment on the establishment and evolution of the Principate? As Hines observes, Oedipus is staged in a post-Ovidian Thebes, a setting that allows characters from Ovid's Theban landscape to elucidate Oedipus's doomed struggle for self-knowledge. By designing a parallel relationship between Iacchus and Oedipus, Seneca shifts the interrogation from matters of self-knowledge to the nature of a sovereign in relation to the people he governs throughout a crisis and its resolution. Frederick All observes that Seneca's Oedipus is distinguished from its Greek predecessor through its focus on the hero's sustained self-examination from beginning to end. The king's nearly solipsistic reflections on his own predicament initially deny him any relation to his people, though his contact with and contamination of the Theban civic body is gradually revealed. Under Oedipus's leadership, one cannot stand for the many without noxious consequences. Hints throughout the drama that Oedipus himself is the source of plague culminate in the words of departure that explicitly identify the king with the pestis and its attendant calamities. And so here we have the final lines of the drama. I drag away with myself deadly stains or infections, vitia, of the earth, brutal fates, the terrifying trembling of disease and wasting and black pestilence and maddening pain. Come with me, with me. It is a pleasure to use these as my guides. If Ovid's Iacchus presents a model of wish fulfillment, of the Principate operating in optimal condition, with a citizenry uniquely, if implausibly and only temporarily, situated to accommodate a single ruler, Seneca's Oedipus will continue to dwell among ashes and bones. As Littlewood observes, any optimism in the play's conclusion is tempered by the dismal cast of characters who accompany the king. Oedipus is not so much resolving and internalizing the plague as he is taking it elsewhere. Certainly, Oedipus's expulsion at the end of the play should make him the scapegoat that restores a healthy civic body. And yet the play constantly looks forward to the renewal of disease and a civil war in the figures of Polynices and Eteocles, reflections of those mimetic doubles who vie for power in Girard's understanding of the plague narrative. And yet Seneca's Oedipus as sacrificial scapegoat in Thebes will complicate Girard's model of crisis resolution. The king's self-mutilation and extended treatment of Jocasta's suicide define the outcome of his struggle for power with Creon, an outcome which in turn the cure of plague depends. Although within the Greek drama too, Oedipus is complicit in his own removal from the community, Sophocles leaves Creon clearly in charge of Thebes in the final lines of the play. Seneca, by contrast, has Creon imprisoned 2/3 into the drama, and he is not heard of in the final acts. Thus, when compared with Creon's clear emergence as ruler in Sophocles' Thebes, no such tidy resolution or clear model of leadership defines the ending of Seneca's drama. Guided by Sophoclean tradition, we might be satisfied with Oedipus's self-imposed departure as a remedy for the civic body, but that same tradition has been contaminated by language of Augustan pestilence, language that has already exposed the operations of internecine strife, the interminable cycle of mimetic violence, demanding that one head of state be rapidly, almost perfunctorily challenged by another. Now, in the last part of my talk, I want to turn to the historical context of Seneca's Oedipus and consider what, if anything, we might glean from the relationship between pestilence as a trauma experienced by the Roman people and the rhetoric of plague in Seneca's tragedy. In turn, I hope that might better allow us to better understand the relationship between our very real experience of COVID-19 and the political discourse that has emerged in response to it. That is to say, and to return to the question, who in fact rejoices in being king or president in the context of an epidemic? In the midst of a real plague, the semantics of the term regnum are split, so that we're forced to distinguish between rejoicing in power and rejoicing in the hard work of governance. Indeed, it is no picnic to be tasked with healing bodies and a body politic sick with civil discord. The answer Jocasta provides to Oedipus's question from the play's opening is hopeful, but also points to the power of our leaders to capitalize on suffering among the populace. Basically, she observes that a good leader takes advantage of adverse affairs. Regium hoc ipsum reor adversa capere. So the more uncertain his status becomes, the more firmly a leader should stand. Nero's attitude towards political dissidents is something Seneca hoped very much to manage, as is most clearly stated in his treatise De Clementia. But we can also detect in the drama a more generalized concern and question over the best form of government to lead a divided people. Is the quasi-monarchical principate the best way of governing Rome? The historian Tacitus, who provides one of our fullest accounts of Nero's reign and frequently betrays nostalgia for the aristocratically governed res publica, also describes an outbreak of pestilence in Campania and likens its impact to that of the Principate. And again, I'm just going to go over the translation here. The force of the pestilence was destroying every kind of human being without apparent corruption from the atmosphere. But the homes were filled with lifeless bodies, the roads with funerals. No sex, no age was free from danger. Slaves and flea-born plebeians died off equally quickly among lamenting of wives and children who, infected while they attended the sick and while they wept, were often being burnt on the same pyre. The deaths of equestrians and senators, though common, were less often wept over, as if through their shared death, they were anticipating the savagery of the princeps. After naming a litany of exiles and executions ordered by Nero, beginning with the emperor's wife, Poppaea Sabina, the historian observes the disastrous impact of this pestilentia, an outbreak not far from Rome, and stresses its traditional leveling of the populace. You know, every kind of people, no sex, or no gender maybe, no age, was free from disease. Nevertheless, two classes stand out whose mortality rates were less remarkable, or literally less wept over. For the senators and equestrians, death in Campania was merely an extension of the Civitia Principis already begun. Tacitus is not merely using the grim details of pestilence for colorful effect, but instead relies on its ferocity and unchecked movement through all social classes to characterize the operations of the Principate. Plague does not so much suggest civil war as it explicitly demonstrates what Romans were left in its aftermath. While Tacitus's reflections on the mirroring relationship between plague and Campania and the plague of the Principate is undeniably cynical, I don't want to end on an entirely pessimistic note. Another of Rome's historians, Livy, who chronicled the city's foundation and development in his Ab Urbe Condita, reminds us repeatedly that epidemic diseases striking the Romans caused strife within the Roman body politic, but also forced that body to reconfigure itself, often in salubrious ways, as offices were distributed and redistributed among social classes. And new customs were introduced to remedy the destruction wrought by disease within the social order. For instance, Livy describes the lectisternium, a ceremony introduced to remedy a plague of 399 BCE, in which images of various deities are placed on couches and honored throughout the city. And this was done explicitly to promote social cohesion during the plague. As part of the festivities, former hostilities were forgotten, strangers enjoyed each other's hospitium, shackles were removed, and lawsuits were suspended. Thus, and we can talk more in the Q&A if you have, there are other examples from Livy that point out the same kind of reconfiguration of the body politic in response to disease. Thus, while we may recognize with Sontag and Girard that plague has an expurgatory power, we don't have to wipe the slate entirely clean to learn from examining the operations of contagion, both real and metaphoric. Entirely new orders in any case are more easily imagined than implemented. Both Ovid and Seneca recognize this in their visions of world built anew or not so anew after a pestilence. Similarly, the 21st century plague narrative that we find ourselves in the process of writing does not have to end with the utter destruction and dissolution of our past, but can instead rely on newly acquired antibodies, pun intended, lessons learned about systemic injustices to help articulate a more resilient body politic. And I will leave with this final slide and these final comments. Our current president doesn't have to be both a symptom of a divided body politic and a harbinger of continued civil strife that lies ahead. And in fact, the end of this paper had two different versions based on the outcome of last week's elections, neither of which, as it turns out, quite fit the bill. COVID-19 has forced us to grapple with economic, racial, and social inequality, a reckoning that most certainly cannot atone for the nearly 240,000 lives lost in this country, but one that is the first step towards correcting those inequalities and finding the right kind of leadership to guide us, not to exult in power, but to do the heavy lifting that will affect meaningful, beneficial change. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter, very much for that talk. It's amazing and more than a bit unfortunate how many parallels there still are today between our own experience and those that Seneca was writing about under Neronian rule, which you've done a very nice job of highlighting here, and I think that gives us all a lot to think about. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of questions coming in here. So I wanted to, maybe while people think and type, start by asking a very broad question, and I don't know that it can be answered, so I apologize beforehand. But correct me if I'm wrong, but these narratives, people have to be able to relate to what's being described, right? So these are metaphors, they're being used to talk about social unrest. I'm curious to know what you think about real world pandemic experiences, whether we're talking about the Campanian experience under Nero or something earlier. Would people have been familiar enough with this widespread, people being thrown on pyres, there not being enough tombs that cover bodies, etc., that they would have really recognized this and it would have resonated in a serious way that they would have connected to on a daily basis, do you think?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think that, of course, if a vehicle of a metaphor is going to be effective, it has to somehow connect in a meaningful way with the tenor. And, endemic disease in Rome is pretty well documented from the beginning of, the origins of the city up through the early Republic and on. And even though sources like Livy, for instance, don't dwell as much on the symptomatology of disease, they certainly recognize, piles of bodies and the burning pyres. And, we know from even later historical accounts of just the problem of disposing of the dead in Rome. Interestingly, contagion, while there's still some argument about how well contagion was understood, it does seem that Romans recognized that social proximity and that groups sharing spaces together could be a source of the spread of disease. And this didn't necessarily conflict with miasma theory, which would argue that an atmosphere could become corrupt. In both of those scenarios, you needed to get away, you needed to leave, as apparently Galen did during the Antonine Plague, and seek a more healthy environment. But I think it's because of that social proximity, that power or that recognition of contact between individuals as being a source of contagion that also allowed the Romans to use contingo and contactus to refer not only to the spread of diseases, but the spread of mores, of good habits and bad habits. And so that allowed a conflation of those two realms of experience, or an even more powerful connection between how the Romans are conducting themselves and their experience together as a diseased body politic.
Great answer, thank you. One thing that I was really struck by in the opening bit of Seneca's Oedipus, where in his monologue, the fact that, just as you say, he doesn't talk about symptoms and he doesn't talk about anything that we might consider epidemiological. But I was struck by the fact that in, I don't know, about halfway through that passage, he does give what seems to me to be a very descriptive account of circumstances that we might generally call environmental around the outbreak of this disease, right? So he talks about hot air without any kind of cooling breeze. He talks about rivers that run dry because of drought. And he talks about a black mist settling both on land, but also like in the heavens. And I thought that those were really interesting details, precisely because he doesn't talk about the symptoms of the disease, but these all sound like very real descriptions to me. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about why those are included where other, relevant, realistic descriptions of what a pandemic would be like, why those are included but others aren't.
Well, partly, I think that's sort of a distortion and exaggeration of what of this idea of miasma, of an atmosphere becoming corrupt and polluted. But it is also true that in his predecessors, starting with Lucretius, but especially in Virgil, there's just a recognition that something is wrong with the atmosphere, and there's often not a real distinction between whether the disease is born from shared fodder, or from just what's wrong with the environment itself. And in fact, that becomes in Virgil, for instance, in his Noric plague, basically he describes what amounts to an inverted golden age. It's like a perversion of the golden age, so that in the past, all these animals are dying, but it also means that animals that used to be hostile towards each other are no longer a threat. And in some ways you have, the fruition of the natural world because there's nobody there to cultivate it. So those kinds of signals in the environment get picked up by later Roman poets. Ovid is going to use this as well, and I think certainly Nero is trying to create a dystopia that also has resonance of the golden age, and of course it's Nero's reign had been, of course, touted as a new golden age, as had the Augustan Principate. So it's hard to really pinpoint whether these are endorsements or critiques of what's going on with this change in the administration. But they certainly do add to the feeling of an epochal evolution, right? Things are changing in a really monumental way. And I think that actually that's one of the other major contributors of these plague narratives to, the later Western tradition is, we constantly, it's not just plague, right? It's dystopia and basically all of the machinery of the civilized world breaks down and we revert to this kind of primitive existence. So, but yeah, Seneca is definitely, he's very interested in details of what's going on in the environment.
Yeah, it's the thing that, just thinking about it more, that strikes me is that in a lot of scholarship that's come out in just the last few years, really maybe in the wake of Kyle Harper's book about drawing connections between environmental change and the onset of disease, what Oedipus is, what Seneca through Oedipus is describing actually sounds very much in line with what some of the work on the influence of volcanoes and climate change and things. It actually sounds like he's talking about that, and it's an interesting thing to observe.
Sure, and Seneca actually does have some in his Quaestiones Naturales, actually does discuss some of the effusions that come from the earth that are often associated with plague. So he was certainly an observer of these natural phenomena, and it wouldn't be unlikely for him to import that into a more fictionalized context.
I'll stop berating you with my questions and I'll take some from the other attendees. So On, I guess, the topic of later reception and repetition beyond the Neronian period, Candace Rice asks about what do we know about later Roman authors, Latin authors, Latin and Greek, after this point? Do they continue to use this motif and use it to reflect upon imperial rule, or does it become less common after the 1st century AD?
Lucan, roughly contemporary with Seneca, I don't mention, but he's certainly very interested in plague and the language of plague to describe civil war. After that, we have Silius Italicus, in particular, who is writing in his Punica about a plague that broke out during the wars against Phoenicia. And it's interesting, he uses plague not so much to describe the, infighting among the soldiers. Of course, this isn't a civil war he's writing about. He uses it really to show how one exceptional individual can really rise to the top and lead a people out of plague. So here we've got, moving into the Flavians, we've still got an interest in using plague as a kind of metaphor. Now, from there, and I know there's intervening writers in between, but my knowledge really pretty much jumps to some of the early Christian poets who are very interested in, for instance, using Virgil's treatment of plague to sort of set a stage where in order to escape the plague, you really need to accept the salvation of Christ. So plague is there. It functions in a different way. It's not so much worried about civic strife, but it does borrow from a lot of the same motifs that the Latin poets had already developed. In particular, you get a lot of effective language describing familial bonds, especially in Endelychius. Paul the Deacon, who's writing a little bit later about the plague of Justinian, is similarly, he's trying to sort of write with a historian's detachment, but he also is interested in what happens to the breakdown of families during the plague. And that comes directly from our Roman sources. So yeah, and that's, from there, that's late antiquity. And then of course, most of what I've worked on then jumps to the Renaissance and its response to bubonic plague. But there's a lot of work to be done, I think, especially among the early Christian poets. And among some of those late antique historians who work on the plague of Justinian. So if anybody needs a dissertation topic, they're out there.
I guess it's interesting to think that in the intervening centuries there too, the Roman world actually comes into contact with some really serious pandemics that I wonder what the impact of that is on this sort of literary tradition of using the metaphor when so many people have actually now lived or not through it.
Sure. Although it's interesting, so we get Procopius's account in Greek, and that's of course the first real outbreak of bubonic plague, and he seems much more indebted to Thucydides, perhaps for obvious reasons. Paul the Deacon actually didn't live through the plague, but he chronicles the plague. And at that point, you're right, there had been such a long tradition of writing about plague that it's almost, it almost becomes a bit tired in terms of just rehashing some of the same language. But then, as and of course, I think one of our earlier speakers mentioned Lucian's comments on plague in the slightly later period, and how he sort of makes fun of the way that historians describe plagues. But really, yes, some of this is repetitive, but it also points to the very features of contagious disease and disease in the body politic that the people were interested in. You know, it's very revelatory in that way. You know, it's not accidental that Romans keep focusing, I mean, with pietas being such a fundamental virtue and value that got distorted during the Civil War. It is not accidental that they are really interested in what happens to families during plague. And you know, that's going to continue.
Right, straight to the modern day.
Yes.
Okay, so another question comes from Sarah Murray, who asks, does plague or pestilence act to restore some sort of balance in societies because of the resulting decline in population, which leads to consequences such as a diminished military? Wouldn't the population reduction cause a higher demand for lower class laborers, which can lead to more competitive wages and less civil strife?
Yes, the short answer. And of course, I think that's been pretty well documented in terms of what happened to the economy during the bubonic plague, the Black Death. We do have evidence, though, also in Livy. You know, I mentioned the lectisternium, but there was also a 5th century plague that was so debilitating within the population that both consuls died, and a number of other officials drawn from the patrician class died. So they really had to start appointing people outside the aristocracy, or at least the patricians, to fill these roles within government. So, you know, and it actually started some traditions, for instance, where, you know, certain officials would always be nominated from the plebeian class. Now, you know, we're dealing with a period in Roman history that's so early that some of the politics are debated, but I do think, you know, Livy is aware that sometimes these, you know, plagues can result in adjustments to the social order that can cause, you know, they don't have to be bad. It's not all negative. God, I hope not. You know, and like I was closing with, you know, you never fully wiped the slate clean. You do cull a certain amount of the population, and that is always tragic. But there are traces of the old social order, and plague will allow you to rethink them. What do we need to bring into this next post-plague generation? What's worth saving? What's worth not saving?
Another question from our audience, this one from Megan Bistricki. A good reflection on our own current experience. But have you seen, or do you know of references in this poetic material or in the literary material to nonsensical things that people did during plagues that historians perhaps would have dismissed, but that might be worth reconsidering now, comparable to, say, injecting bleach, for example?
Well, you know, most of the accounts that I've looked at, you know, so yes, in terms of behaviors and irregular behaviors, you know, Thucydides recognized it, Lucretius recognized it, Ovid recognizes it, Virgil not so much because he's dealing with animal plague, but all of these writers do recognize that people are acting a little crazy. They're doing things that normally shame would have prevented them from doing because it's like the end of the world. Now, as for crazy medical interventions, most of the time we get this idea that medicine is useless either way. So, you know, the doctors who attend to the sick end up just getting sick and dying. You know, people who neglect the sick also end up getting sick and dying. You know, Ovid has a famous line about how or this is Lucretius, basically about how medicine muttered under its breath. It didn't know what to do. And in fact, in terms of Hippocratic medicine, plague in general was considered beyond the purview of most doctors, because it wasn't an individual whose humors needed adjusting. This is a whole population that has been afflicted, and there's probably not only an atmospheric element, but a divine element. So shooting bleach isn't going to help. What is going to help is perhaps appealing to the gods, consulting the Sibylline books and whatnot. Right. And, you know, the Tiber Island was also sort of an intuitively good idea because it isolated the sick, but that's a whole different topic.
Yeah, a really interesting one too, right? To think about, this is something we've been talking about recently in classes, the role of healing sanctuaries during pandemic events and what that must have been like. And my understanding, at least, is that that's a very hard experience to get at from the material that we have surviving, but certainly worth thinking about. Right.
We have just sort of a few fragments or references to what was going on in the Tiber Island temple in particular. You know, Ovid has a great account of how that temple was founded and why. But in terms of historical references, I've seen less of them. Sort of. I know there was an edict passed by Claudius that punished people who had abandoned their slaves, and basically said the slaves could be free. If you dropped off a slave on the Tiber Island and just left them there to die, and they survived, then they would get their freedom.
Fair
but
enough.
Yes. You know, and there's so many layers. If you go to the Tiber Island now, there are just so many layers built over it. You can actually go into the substructures and see a little bit of what was there. But of course, there's a church of San Bartolomeo on top of it now. So it's harder to get an idea of what went on there.
Right. Well, maybe as a final question here, as I watch time go by, I wonder, just as a final point, thinking now about the history of disease and the way that different societies, but especially the Romans, the way that they reflect upon it and interact with it, and in this case, you know, even transfer it into the world of metaphor. What do you think about historians in this? And can we be sure that when a historian like Tacitus or Dio, when they make reference to some of these events, do we think that they're doing it objectively, or are there instances where this same kind of metaphor for societal unrest works its way into what we might normally think of as more factually based historical writing? And does that pose a problem as we continue to reevaluate this information moving forward?
Well, yes, I do think that these writers, you know, Livy, Tacitus, Dio, are all sort of using, you know, they want to give us some facts of the plague, but they are, for instance, Livy is very interested in the body politic metaphor throughout his histories. So he's going to capitalize on that when a plague breaks out. You know, Dio, his account of the plague that struck during the reign of Augustus gives us a few facts about it, but it also allows him to reflect on why the people decided to hand over even more authority to Augustus. And of course, Tacitus, as we just saw in that one of the earlier slides, you know, he's using plague as well to comment on the savagery of the Principate. So even though he does perhaps rightly point out that, you know, plague killed everybody, every gender, every age, that may have been true. You know, you're going to have to, it's going to be an endless process of sifting through what the rhetoric of plague is versus what the reality was. And, you know, that's something we're faced with today as well, you know, because the rhetoric of plague is determined by people who are writing the history of COVID-19 now. And, you know, those of us who lived it may have a very different experience of it.
Right. And that's such an important point. So thank you very much for ending on that, because I think that gives us a lot to think about, both in antiquity and in the modern day. And let me thank you again for your wonderfully fascinating talk and for this discussion afterwards. Thank you very much for joining us for this event. And thank everybody out in our virtual audience for attending. I hope that everybody will be able to join us next Tuesday, November 17th, for our fourth and final entry in this series by Marcel Keller, who'll be talking about paleogenetic insights into the first pandemic from 541 to 750. Hunter, thank you again.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity. And if anybody wants to email me with questions later, I'd be happy to chime in.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody has a very good week, slightly more sane week than last, and we'll see you again next Tuesday.